Hey, LinkedIn, and welcome back to Business Unusual. This is a live show where we're talking as a community about the changing nature of work. I'm your host, Caroline Fairchild, coming to you from my home office here in New York City. National protests against the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor are rightfully dominating the news cycle this week, as nationally, the Black community and its allies ask for justice. And while historically private sector leaders may have shied away from participating in these conversations, corporate executives are now speaking out directly about race relations in America. In an interview with Andrew Ross Sorkin on CNBC, Ariel Investments co-CEO and president Mellody Hobson had this to say about why that is.
The role of the CEO and the role of the corporation has changed. And while many might want to sit out these issues, they can't. They literally can't. We've now been pulled into so many issues as corporate America, from mental health issues, you have to worry about live shooters, to issues related to inequality, to issues related to obviously public health, in ways that CEOs never expected that they would have to live or work or think or prepare. It is a new day.
And there's evidence of that new day here on LinkedIn, where corporate executives are coming out en masse to speak openly, honestly, and directly about police brutality and racism in America. To give you a sense of that conversation, I wanted to share just a few posts from executives that we're seeing here on LinkedIn, starting with PayPal CEO Dan Schulman, who says, "We cannot stay silent in the face of racial injustice, whether it is within our own communities or outside of them. No one should feel threatened or afraid because of the color of their skin, of who they are, or who they choose to be." We also heard from Target EVP Lasha Ward, who says, "We don't pretend to have all the answers, so it's with humility that we listen, learn, and co-create solutions with the community." Kroger CEO Roger McMullen also came to the platform to say, "We all have a responsibility to speak out against racism and injustice when and where we see it. But there's more. We have a responsibility to be more fully examine ourselves and to engage one another with greater compassion and deeper listening." And then SoftBank CEO Marcella Clark shared this as well. "I am Hispanic. Racism exists every day in our lives. We don't talk enough about it and choose to ignore it. Black and Hispanics are discriminated against every day. This time, the only difference is that they got caught." And those are just a few of hundreds that we're seeing here on LinkedIn. And today is Blackout Tuesday, where across social platforms, people are posting Black squares to show their solidarity for the Black Lives Matters movement. On today's show, we're going to speak with two experts who have been tracking race relations in America, specifically as it relates to the corporate world during their careers. We'll hear from Laura Morgan Roberts, who is a professor of the practice at University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. She's also the co-editor of Race, Work, and Leadership: New Perspectives on the Black Experience, to get her take on how corporate leaders are changing. We'll also hear from Frances Frei, a professor at Harvard Business School and a former SVP at Uber, to discuss building cultures of inclusion during challenging times. You see her post here where she says, "As a foundation, everyone must feel safe, full stop, and leaders must protect and empower those people who are more likely to experience the absence of safety." But before we hear from our guests, I want to hear from you. The whole point of this show is to have a conversation as a community about the new nature of work, and today, how the protests that we're seeing nationally are impacting you on the job. So please share your insights with us in the stream. If you have questions for our experts about what's going on with you, please let us know. And with that, I want to bring on Frances and Laura to the show. Thank you both so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
Such a pleasure here.
Laura, I want to start with you. You've been tracking race relations for the entirety of your career. This response that we just got a taste of earlier on in the show of how corporate America is responding to these protests, is it different than what we've seen in the past?
It is different. The wide-ranging scope of leaders who are coming out and making public statements, one after one after one, is something that we haven't seen before. I started soliciting examples of these statements for my research and consulting purposes last week. And Thursday, when I started searching and requesting examples of the statements, there were very, very few. But by Sunday, Monday, even a lot of the individuals who said, "I don't think my company will ever say anything about this," were forwarding me examples of their CEO statements saying, "Wow, I guess I was wrong. They actually did speak." So in that respect, I think it's worth noting that This is new. This is different. It's not the first time that corporate leaders have spoken out against racism. I'm on faculty at UVA, as you mentioned. I'm also an alum of UVA, class of 1996, and I'm a descendant of a former cook who was an African American woman at UVA in the 19th century. And so when the white supremacists rallied in front of the rotunda at UVA, that was also a moment when leaders of corporations made a public statement. But at that point, it was a small group of leaders that were speaking out and saying what Mellody Hobson just said. We as corporate leaders can no longer remain silent about racism in our society. It's our responsibility to speak up about it now.
And Frances, I'd love your take on the response that we're seeing to date and why corporate leaders are feeling this power and this passion to come to platforms like LinkedIn and share their voice.
Yeah, I mean, the best sense I can make of it is that it's happening amidst a global pandemic where the whole world is sort of breathing the same breath for the first time. There's not like a geographic pocket. So the whole world is like feeling compassion and feeling fragility in financially, health-wise, and we're pretty attuned to one another in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime. And then you put on top of this, what on the one hand is a tragically familiar, but on the other hand, just in this new context, just feels abhorrent to everyone. So I don't know. My theory is that we're doing it in the midst of a global pandemic, and somehow that has sanded us to finally react with some appropriateness to the murdering of someone because of the color of their skin.
And Laura, this pandemic, it has changed the way that corporate leaders have to think about D&I efforts, and then put the protests on top of that. Typically, when we think about diversity and inclusion within corporate America, we think about employee belonging, inclusion. How do these protests change the conversation that corporate leaders are having to have with their employees, as well as what they're saying publicly about how they feel about these issues?
Yeah, I think there are two ways that we might think about how our current state of affairs and the realization is requiring us to change the way we think about diversity and inclusion in organizations. And part of this, Caroline, you and I talked about, I think it might have been earlier this year, about how many D&I initiatives had, in my shorthand, erased race from the equation, that it was so difficult to grapple with, so painful to grapple with, the longstanding history of racial inequality in subtle and overt ways, in structural ways, and in interpersonal ways, that many leaders just shied away from talking about race in lieu of talking about other dimensions of difference, or even just moving toward a more palatable conversation about diversity of thought and hooking that onto a business case for diversity. If we can just bring in enough representation from different backgrounds, broadly stated, then, add and stir, voila, we'll have diversity of thought. But that didn't require corporations or higher education or, nonprofits and other sectors to really think about the ways that race, class, and gender have all just created an ongoing set of structural inequalities throughout society. And so that then brings to the second realization that perhaps the business case for diversity has fallen short in the respect that it has provided us an avenue for not talking as much about these moral issues. And right now, when we look at the outrage of a murder with such callous regard or response to the loss of human life, both in the moment, but also in the days and weeks that follow, it becomes more of an issue of moral concern and less about the immediate profitability of having diversity and representation within our company. It requires all leaders to reflect on their values and say, what kind of world do we want to create, and what is my role as a leader in creating that world, both within my organization, but also in the society more broadly.
And I want to speak to how the moral case for diversity is blending in, rightfully so, to the business case as well. But before we do, I want to say hello to some people who are joining us here on the stream. We have Lori from Chicago, Jean from Connecticut, Daniel from California, Stephanie from Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us on today's show. Zoe says, exactly, actions, not just words. We've been hearing words for decades. Valerie says, corporate leaders need to back up words with actions for systematic change. So thank you all for joining us on today's show. Frances, let's talk about this moral case. You've put together this inclusion dial, which helps corporations think about building inclusive cultures. The baseline for that is feeling safe. If you don't feel safe at work, you are not going to feel included. How did those protests make people of color, the Black community, feel right now in the office? And how do corporate leaders need to respond?
So I think any person of color, so a Black employee, or if you appear Asian because of COVID, I think that people are not feeling safe, and it would be tempting for companies to go to the second stage of the inclusion dial, which is to try to make them feel welcome. And I would just go back to safe. So safety is, do I feel physically and emotionally safe? And I think we can just go ahead and say that folks do not. So then what should we do as they don't? Which is, we know what the lessons aren't. Let's ask people that aren't feeling safe to take on more work and to shoulder the burden of the problems. Like, that's a terrible thing to do for someone who doesn't feel safe. What we should do is check in with people, like deeply listen to them, proactively help, and then we should get to work. Those of us that do feel safe, we have to get the work to set the conditions for it to be safe for everyone. So one of the things we've been saying for a long time is that race is not an African-American problem. Gender is not a women's problem. Well, I mean, these protests show race is not an African-American problem. Our entire country is embroiled in this. And I think to what Laura said, we have been dodging this issue for 400 years. And the only change I have ever seen work is it has three parts to it. You honor the past, you have a clear and compelling change mandate, and you have a rigorous and optimistic way forward. Like, literally, I've never seen a change that was successful that didn't go through all of those three. And every change I've seen can fall off on one of those. Well, in race in America, we have never, ever, ever honored the past. We have now a very clear and compelling mandate. That's what the protests are doing. And that's like, it couldn't be more clear and compelling, but we got to address the past with honor. And then our leaders have to have a super rigorous and a super optimistic way forward. And if our leaders can't come up with rigor and optimism, I would really ask them to step aside and to permit someone to lead who can.
And speaking of that honoring of the past, I'm seeing some comments in the stream that remind me of conversations I've had in the past with Laura. Ben says, these companies want diversity and inclusion to be easy, but you're going to have to get uncomfortable to undo what white privilege has created. Laura, a bunch of white people are just afraid of talking about race at work, for the afraid that they're going to be seen as prejudiced, so they just stay silent. Unpack a little bit for us what intention that has in terms of the Black colleagues who are right now having to work remotely or coming into the office under the backdrop of these protests and are met with silence from their Black colleagues.
Well, the silence signals that either the suffering is not seen, it's not understood, or it's not validated. And so that silence from any peer in an organization suggests that this is not a space where it's safe for me to really engage and show up in an authentic way and build sincere and genuine relationships with the people that I work. It also calls into question the espoused values and statements around inclusion, around belongingness, around authenticity, around positive impact and social change that are often, part of the frameworks and the language that corporations use to describe themselves. But in the core practices, when that compassion and the courage is needed most, this is when we see the fear on the part of dominant group members start to take over. The challenge is that because they're dominant group members, their silence then tends to dominate the tone of the organization. And it puts a person on the margins who wants to speak out in a tenuous position. They have to then decide whether or not they want to advocate or educate, if they want to risk being seen as an agitator within their organization, and if they're putting their careers on the line to either try to raise awareness of what's happening out there, or for many employees, it's that shocking realization that, oh my goodness, what happened between Amy and Chris Cooper in Central Park a few days ago? That same kind of interaction happened to me in a conference room here 2 or 3 years ago. And when I tried to tell my colleagues about it and my bosses about it, they didn't believe my story. They believed the other person's story. So there is a triggering effect that the silence then just reinforces that it's not a safe space, and perhaps it's also not a space that's truly committed to including and reckoning with the ways in which we all fall short. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's asking for anyone to be perfect. What we're asking is for people to be genuine in their desire to learn and grow better together.
Nobody is perfect, but if you look at the work, say, of Dolly Chugg, who talks a lot about being a good person and therefore thinking that you are not racist, and how that impacts the conversations that we're having in the office today. Frances, this whole being silent, it starts with this fear of just saying the wrong thing. What have you found in your work in terms of misconceptions around that fear of, I'm just not going to say anything, because if I say the wrong thing, it's going to be worse than saying nothing at all?
Yeah, so the thing, when I think about inclusion, and it's so clear that the people that are comfortable, I think Laura used the dominant group, but those of us that are comfortable, that's the time for us to act on that issue. And so if I'm comfortable, I have to act. And if I have to undertake a little bit of fear, I have to undertake a little bit of fear, but I'm doing it on top of comfort. If you notice what Laura said, like a Black person coming into work might have to risk a whole bunch on top of feeling totally destabilized. Well, my going into the office and talking about race, it's not on the top of my being like personally destabilized. And so it's my obligation to do it. If I have a little bit of fear, I think we just have to do it with curiosity, which is like, what's the fear? I'm going to say something wrong. I say things wrong all the time. That I happen to say something wrong about race, I'll get corrected like I get corrected when I say something wrong about everything else. So I think we have to lessen the supercharged nature of this. We're all human. We're all going to learn. This is yet another thing that we're going to learn as we talk. But I really think there's an obligation. And I'll also say the inclusion dial that we talk about, the first half of it is, regardless of who we are, we need to be safe and welcome. But where we get the competitive advantage, where we get the performance imperative of difference and being inclusive of difference, is when we celebrate that, oh my gosh, we are going to win because of the inclusive diversity that we have. Like that's where, so there is a moral imperative and there's a performance imperative. I think businesses have been thinking about the performance imperative for a long time. I frankly find that a very easy case to make. And I think what we're watching on TV is that there is also a very urgent moral imperative. Very fortunately, neither of them contradict each other. They both go to the same place.
Seen a lot of members in the stream echoing the sentiment that we're talking about right now on the show. Diana says, the silence is the most painful thing right now. When my coworkers ignore the reality of this experience, I become discouraged and disenchanted. Diana, thank you so much for joining us. Dale says, we have an obligation to our fellow humans to speak up. White people recognize that you do not understand what it's like to be Black in America. Take a moment to stop silencing, supporting, and actually doing something in your local communities to affect real change across the spectrum is where it starts. So Dale, thank you for joining us as well. Laura, for the corporate executives who are speaking out right now about this, what it keeps coming across to me is, in order to speak about this, you have to be okay making mistakes, and you have to be okay with saying the wrong things. These are two tenets that are the antithesis of what we think about corporate leaders and corporate strength. Help us unpack in terms of why the definition of a corporate leader needs to change right now in order for these conversations to be happening across the workplace.
Well, there are those who would label many of the challenges that we're facing right now wicked problems. I mean, they're longstanding, they're very complex, and they involve an interconnection of a lot of different systems. You think about the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities, which was actually a headline story a week ago before the racial protests began. And I would say those two are not at all unrelated. But even in that respect, we're talking about a big problem that leaders had not confronted before. So if the assumption is that the leader has been deemed leader because they have all the answers, then obviously we're stuck at that point. What the new take on leadership needs to be to address these 21st century issues is that the leader is an expert in learning, and the leader has the humility and the wisdom to be able to listen and to learn. And then I would add one more piece to that is the courage to hold themselves and hold the organization accountable, because the exasperation that's being expressed, whether it's in the boardroom or on Main Street, is the same tenor. It comes from a place of feeling like one has been trying to make this case. We're even when people say that they hear and see that injustices are taking place, they're not observing that progress. They're not seeing people take specific steps. And you say, well, what does that look like? What is the steps? I mean, we're having the forums, we're having town halls, we're, celebrating Black History Month. Like we're talking about race. We're entering into this space, talking about here what happens to hold individuals and to hold the system accountable toward engaging in practices that uphold the dignity and the equity of the system itself. And when people are violating those systems, that leaders have the courage to speak and try to create systems and put systems in place that course correct for that type of behavior.
Can I follow on to that, Carolyn? Because I think it's exactly right. And so then I'm thinking, like, what could a CEO that's listening in right now, like, what could they do? And so here would be my advice for anyone who's listening in that's leading a company. Take a look at start at the senior leadership of your company, but take a look at the top of your company and look to see, are white people and Black people equally thriving? So are there demographic discrepancies between like who gets promoted, between who gets paid? So do it on achievement and also do it on satisfaction, self-reported satisfaction. If there are no demographic tendencies along race for who's thriving in your organization, then I encourage you to go look outside your organization. But if there are demographic tendencies in there, I would say your job, like right now, is to close those gaps. Because it's going to be we can talk all we want outside the organizations, but if we're not doing it within the organizations, it's going to be a chicken and the egg. So Laura, I'm curious, like that's what my instinct is. Does that resonate to you?
That definitely resonates as a way of really doing an audit of where we are at present in the here and now. What also struck me from what you said earlier, Francis, was about the need to acknowledge the past. So acknowledging the past, right? You said take an honest account of the past. So we can't just take a snapshot of where we are at the here and now, but we need to look over time in the life of the organization, in the ways in which the organization is thriving. How have some practices enabled that thriving that may also have enabled longstanding inequality? That's a really difficult conversation to have. One of the quotations that Ella Washington, my co-author, and I included in our article that was published yesterday, which you referenced about corporations taking action against racism in HBR, was one of the company statements, but this was actually a university president statement from John DeGioia at Georgetown. And we selected that statement in particular to lend insight into what it means to own the past. And say, we recognize that over a period of years, our institution has engaged in some actions around racism that have done harm to society and to our community at present. And so we want to reconcile with that as well.
I think that's a great point. And what we're speaking about right now is corporate executive response. But Laura, going back to what you said earlier, this can't just be something that executives are posting on LinkedIn or town halls that they're hosting every time that these protests come back into the news. This is something that systematically we're going to need to see change in terms of how all employees are speaking about race at work. I see a question here from Katie that I'd love for one of you to address, where she says, what do you say to avoid seeming trite and condescending? I want to say what I see, but feel that it's just going to emphasize my white privilege. For Katie, who may not is leading a company, but is in an organization right now where she sees pain, what do you say to her in terms of the role that she plays in this?
I'll start, and then Laura can make it better, as she always does. So, if you are in the majority, it is up to you to shoulder the discomfort. So, if you feel burdened by your white privilege, if you feel like, just get on with it anyway and use it to good effect. And the good effect is that when I'm thinking about, oh, I feel bad, I have the camera pointed the wrong way. It shouldn't be about me. If you want to take a leadership role, which is she's saying she does, leadership is about making other people better. So she shouldn't be thinking about her own hangups. She should be thinking, how can I help those that are more vulnerable than me? How can I help make them better? And if I'm going to make mistakes, it's too self-distracted for me. I'm less important than the people I'm trying to help. So I got to get over me. And of course I'm going to learn. And as Laura said earlier, organizations that learn at a faster rate win. So learning is the most beautiful part of an organization. But just stop thinking about yourself so much and start thinking about those that you're trying to help.
That's a great point. Laura, anything
That
to
might
add?
have been too harsh.
Yeah, I mean, and this metaphor may be a little intense, but I'd say even within the corporate space, it's time to put yourself out of your comfort zone and maybe even put yourself in the line of fire, so to speak. So when you see that people are making disparaging comments and communicating low expectations and relying on negative and hurtful stereotypes to describe other people on your team or in your organization, that's a moment when you have an opportunity to make a difference. So much of what we see in society feels really overwhelming because we're looking at inequality in such a dramatic and broad way. And then we don't know that we have any power to do something about it. But every time you give somebody who's been marginalized and devalued and oppressed an opportunity that they rightly deserve to be able to grow and develop and thrive, you are planting a seed that will help us to grow a more equitable society. But absolutely, Frances, the camera has to be on that person and on trying to find and cultivate those opportunities for them, and not so much about what we're afraid we might lose or sacrifice ourselves.
Beautiful.
Well, Laura and Frances, I have learned so much today on the show, and I know I speak for the stream when I say I know that they have as well. Dana says, path to peace requires being uncomfortable when discussing and owning shortcomings of lack of knowledge. We just had a ton of knowledge from you in terms of what both CEOs as well as individual employees can do to talk about race openly at work and hopefully change the dialogue and the conversation. Thank you so much for your insights and for joining us on Business Unusual.
Thank
It's a pleasure.
you.
It's a pleasure. Great to see you, Laura.
Great to see you too, Frances.
That was Laura Morgan Roberts as well as Frances Frei joining us to unpack how the conversation among race relations is changing in corporate America against the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter protests. I want to thank them for joining us on today's show. This is Business Unusual, a live show coming to you daily from the LinkedIn news page where we're talking about the changing nature of work. We're going to continue the conversation tomorrow. My colleague Susie Jackson will be back here with another conversation against the protests and what it means for race equity in the workplace moving forward. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thank you so much for joining us.